if it's between Obama and Romney, there isn't all that much difference, except for the crowd that they bring with them. Romney would have to take Gingrich or Santorum as a vice president and probably have some pretty extreme candidates for the Supreme Court. So that's the downside.
Even a President Obama and a President Romney, when it comes to questions of taxation, particularly taxation of the so-called 1%, issues like carried interest. Do you see any difference there?
That is the big difference, and that has led my hedge fund community abandon Obama in favor of any Republican, because they don't like to be taxed.
You one of Lenin's useful idiots in the view of your fellow hedge fund billionaires to be making this kind of argument?
Well, I suppose so. I'm a traitor to my class. President Obama has deployed the confidence multiplier and claims to have contained the recession. If there is a double dip, the population will become susceptible to all kinds of fear-mongering and populist demagogy. If President Obama fails, the next administration will be sorely tempted to create diversions from troubles at home, and that could be very dangerous for the world.
I tell you this, there is no disputing how generous you've been with your money. You've given better than $5 billion to a variety of... Here's what I'm asking you, though. All right? Now, your quantum fund is registered actually in Netherlands Antilles. So what I'm curious about is when you advocate that the well-to-do should pay more in taxes... No, I'm just asking. Please. Do you see where some would say, wait a minute?
No. Let me say two things. First of all, I pay taxes. My fund is in Curaçao. The foreign shareholders don't pay taxes. I pay taxes on my income from that fund. My management company is located here. We pay taxes. So this is a lie that I have seen in print, and I've seen it repeated.
So the other taxes you pay in this country, are they at the 35%?
I would like to discuss policy. You're now falling into the trap of your colleagues in Fox, which shall remain nameless, because I think they are so disreputable. I wouldn't want to mention their names.
Soros, I respect you.
That's why I came here. All right?
I don't think we can be demeaning.
So let's not get personal.
What I'm asking you.
Let's talk about policy.
But no, because this is part and parcel of the same story.
Yeah. The whole story. Let your public find out who I really am, what I really stand for. I chose this country as my home, right? And I want this country to be worthy of the principles that have made it great. And now we are losing those principles. We are being misled. We need to correct it.
You mentioned that personalities of this network. You meant Bill O'Reilly.
Of course I meant Bill O'Reilly, but I really consider him disreputable.
Well, you don't like him at all?
No, I think that he uses methods that I find unacceptable. That's why I wouldn't go on his show. I'm happy to be here, but I have to stop you when you get personal.
Well, the reason why I read a lot of books, I loved your book, and I love Bill O'Reilly's book, Culture War, because he made some pretty strong remarks about you, Mr. Soros. He said, Soros is a smart, ruthless ideologue who will stop at nothing to advance the secular progressive offensive. He has no scruples, ethics, or sense of fair play. A lot of nasty things said about you. Yeah, people who said that your daddy Warbucks a drug legalization. Yes. That was a Democratic former HUD secretary, health secretary. But does that bug you that no matter what good you try to do, people come back and say, Daddy Warbucks with evil intentions?
Look, that is actually what pushes me to stand up. You know, I supported people who stood up for freedom and democracy in countries like the Soviet Union. And when I see that the principles of open society are undermined by people like O'Reilly with his methods, then I feel that I've got to stand up. So the more he insults me, the more I will stand up against it, because he is using a remarkable trick. You know, he comes straight out of George Orwell, who wrote a book, 1984, you know, Newspeak, that you say the opposite of what you mean. I decided
to set up a foundation devoted to the promotion of open society. I defined its mission as opening up closed societies, correcting the deficiencies of open societies, and promoting a critical mode of thinking. As time went by, I became increasingly involved in philanthropy. I established a foundation here in Hungary in 1984, when it was still under communist rule. In China in 1986, in Poland and the Soviet Union in 1987, and as the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia disintegrated, I set up a network of foundations that covered almost the entire former communist world. In this way, I acquired some practical experience in building open societies. I learned a lot. I discovered things that I should have known in the first place. For instance, that the disintegration of closed societies doesn't necessarily lead to the birth of open societies. It may result in just a continuing disintegration until a new regime emerges that bears more resemblance to the regime that had collapsed than to an open society. The event that forced me to thoroughly reconsider the concept of open society was the re-election of President Bush in the United States in 2004. Here was the oldest and most successful democracy in the world, violating the principles for which it was supposed to stand by engaging in human rights violations in the name of fighting a war on terror and invading Iraq on false pretenses. Yet, he was re-elected. How was that possible? I had to ask myself, what was wrong with America? I wrote a couple of books trying to answer that question. I blamed the Bush administration for misleading the people, and I blamed the people for allowing the Bush administration to mislead them. As I probed deeper, I started to question my own conceptual framework. I discovered a flaw in the concept of open society insofar as Popper was mainly concerned with the problems of understanding reality. Look at the Bush presidency. It was remarkably successful in manipulating reality. By declaring war on terror, it managed to line up the nation behind the president and pave the way to the invasion of Iraq. The invasion was meant to establish the supremacy of the United States in the world, but it achieved the exact opposite. America lost power and influence precipitously, and George W. Bush is widely considered the worst president of the United States ever had. Capitalism is not directly opposed to open society the way Soviet communism was. Nevertheless, it poses some serious threats. There is a deep-seated conflict between capitalism and open society, market values and social values. The conflict has been successfully covered up by the market fundamentalist ideology, which gained the upper hand in the 1980s during Ronald Reagan's presidency.
George Soros says the current housing and credit problem all starts with Ronald Reagan.
Well, look, Reagan has been kind of idolized. He's been he talked about the magic of the marketplace. He sold that idea that you can leave it to the market. In this case, believe it or not, I'm not actually guided by political considerations. I'm well known as being an opponent of Bush,
and so on. So it's thought that everything is political. No, just analytically, that's when it really started, and it started with Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. In the United States, politics takes the form of representative democracy. People elect representatives who operate the levers of power. They are agents who are supposed to represent the interests of the people. In reality, they tend to put their own interests ahead of the interests of the people. Getting elected is expensive, and representatives are beholden to their supporters. Those who don't play the game, don't get elected. That's how money pollutes politics, and special interests trump the public interest. The agency problem in the American political system is not new. It's inherent in a representative democracy. The right to petition elected representatives was written into the Constitution. Yet, the agency problem seems to be much more severe today than it was even as recently as my arrival in the United States in 1956. Why? There are several objective historical developments which may be held partly responsible, notably the development of sophisticated methods of manipulating public opinion and the growth of special interests. But the main culprit is a decline in public morality fostered by the rise of market fundamentalism. I'd like to think that at the time of the founding of the Republic, citizens were genuinely guided by a sense of civic virtue. Fortunately, the founding fathers didn't put much faith in that and built the Constitution on the division of powers. They created checks and balances between competing interests. That's why the Constitution holds up so well in spite of the decline in morality. Even when I first arrived in 1956, people professed to be guided by intrinsic values like honesty and integrity. It may have been hypocritical with all kinds of vices clandestinely practiced, but still, it was very different from today's public life, where the blatant pursuit of self-interest is openly admitted and people are admired for being successful, irrespective of how they achieved it. Once I became aware of the agency problem, I discovered it everywhere. Communism failed because of the agency problem. Karl Marx's proposition, from everybody according to their ability and to everybody according to their needs, was a very attractive idea, but the communist rulers put their own interests ahead of the interests of the people. The agency problem is also the bane of representative democracy, because the elected representatives use their powers for their own interests to the detriment of the common interest. Right now, the Chinese public is willing to subordinate individual freedom to political stability and economic advancement, but that may not continue indefinitely. Corruption is a big problem, and China needs the rule of law so that citizens can criticize the government and prevent it from abusing its powers. And China needs to become a more open society in order to be acceptable to the rest of the world. The rest of the world will never subordinate the freedom of the individual to the prosperity of the Chinese state. As China is becoming a world leader, it must learn
to pay more attention to the opinion of the rest of the world. But all this may be happening too fast for the Chinese leadership to adjust to it. China is accustomed to thinking of itself as the victim of imperialism. So it doesn't realize that it's beginning to occupy an imperialistic position. That's why it has such difficulties in dealing with Africa and its own ethnic minorities. Hopefully, the Chinese leadership will rise to the occasion. It's no exaggeration to say that the future of the world depends on it. This would be the time, because you really need to bring China into the creation of a new world order, financial world order. They are kind of reluctant members of the IMF. They play along, but they don't make much of a contribution because it's not their institution. Their share is not commensurate. Their voting rights are not commensurate to their weight. So I think you need a new world order that China has to be part of the process of creating it, and they have to buy in. They have to own it the same way as, let's say, the United States owns the Washington Consensus, the current order. China will emerge as the motor replacing the US consumer. And of course it's a smaller motor because the Chinese economy is much smaller. So the world economy will have less of a motor. So it will move forward slower than it has in the last 25 years. But China will be the engine driving it forward, and the US will be actually a drag that's being pulled along through a gradual decline in the value of the dollar.
And what about the American concern that aiding and abetting this move away from the dollar as the world's reserve currency ultimately means a weakening of the U.S. economy?
It is not necessarily in our interest to have the dollar as the sole world currency, because as the world economy grows, it needs additional currency. And if the dollar is that additional currency, it means that the U.S. has to have a chronic current account deficit. And that is not appropriate. So I think it's in our interest as well to reform the system. I think this is a healthy, if painful, adjustment that the world has to go through.
If America doesn't actively take part in this sort of renegotiation of global finance, what will happen? What's your nightmare scenario?
Well, the Chinese will go bilateral. They already do it. They already have a clearing arrangement with Argentina, and I think they're working on one with Brazil, and you will find that there will be more and more bilateral arrangements. So the dollar will remain the main international currency, but its use will decline. So I think that a world of bilateral relations is less desirable than a continuation of a multilateral system. But the system we have now has actually broken down, only we haven't quite recognized it. And so you need to create a new one. And this is the time to do it.
In the United States, how worried are you about the budget deficit and maybe about the possibility of inflation?
Well, certainly a decline in the value of the dollar is necessary in order to compensate for the fact that the U.S. economy will remain rather weak, will be a drag on the global economy. People may not know what's good for them, but profits do provide an objective criterion by which market participants' performance can be measured. No wonder that the profit motive has gained such prominence among the values that guide people's behavior. Not only do profits provide the means for the pursuit of whatever ends people may have, but they also serve as an end in itself, because as a reliable measure of success, they attract other people's admiration and generate self-esteem. Indeed, many successful business people feel much more secure in making money than in using their wealth. The spread of market values has brought immense economic benefits in the course of history. Looking back, Christianity used to treat the pursuit of profit as sinful. This hampered economic development. The Reformation then facilitated the development of markets and opened the way to material progress and the accumulation of wealth. Society underwent a great transformation. Traditional relationships were replaced by contractual ones. Contractual relations came to penetrate into more and more spheres of social life, and eventually relationships started to be replaced by transactions. The pace of change continued to accelerate. It spread up tremendously during my lifetime. The difference between my childhood in Hungary and my adult life in America is quite dramatic. So were the changes that occurred in America between my arrival in 1956 and the present day. When I first came to America, I was struck by how much further market values had penetrated into society than in my native Hungary, or even England, where traditional values and class distinctions still prevailed. Since then, both England and America underwent a further transformation. The professions like medicine and law became businesses. In my view, this has had a destabilizing effect on society, just as market fundamentalism has had a destabilizing effect on financial markets. One way to bring home the objective reality is to draw attention to death as a fact of life. The mind finds it difficult to accept the idea of ceasing to exist, and all kinds of narratives and myths have sprung up around the idea of life after death. I have been struck by an Aztec ritual where teams compete in a ball game and the winners are sacrificed to the gods. That's an extreme example of the power of such myths. Yet the fact remains that the winning team died. Even so, I have to admit that the absence of life after death can't be proven to those who believe in it. My insistence on the importance of the objective aspect of reality is a matter of personal belief. Indeed, it has a curious resemblance to a religious belief. The objective aspect of reality, as I have constructed it, has many of the attributes of God as conceived in monotheistic religions. It's omnipresent and all-powerful, yet the ways of its working remain somewhat mysterious. The financial institutions that have survived are in a stronger competitive position than ever before, and they will resist a systemic overhaul that would curb their powers. What is lacking is a general recognition that the system is broken and needs to be reinvented. That's why it would be so important that the theory of financial markets I've outlined in these lectures should gain wider acceptance.